this episode, we start by turning the idea of a framework into something practical, because beginners often hear the word framework and imagine a thick document that sits on a shelf while real work happens elsewhere. In privacy engineering, a framework is a structured way to organize what a good privacy program must do so decisions are consistent, controls are complete, and evidence is easy to produce when someone asks how you know privacy is being handled responsibly. The CDPSE exam expects you to understand frameworks as tools for governance and risk management, not as trivia about which framework has which name. A framework helps an organization avoid gaps by providing categories and expectations, and it also helps avoid duplication by clarifying how policies, procedures, and technical controls fit together. Frameworks are especially valuable when teams grow, when vendors are added, or when systems expand into new regions, because they provide a common language across different roles and technical environments. You will learn how to use privacy frameworks to structure controls, align evidence to those controls, and guide governance decisions like approvals, risk acceptance, and program monitoring. By the end, you should be able to explain what a privacy framework does, why it matters, how it works at a high level, and how it supports repeatable, defensible decision-making across an organization. A helpful starting point is understanding the problem frameworks are designed to solve, because that problem shows up repeatedly in privacy programs that do not use structured approaches. Without a framework, privacy work often becomes reactive and inconsistent, with different teams creating their own rules, documenting in different ways, and prioritizing risks based on personality rather than policy. This leads to control gaps, such as strong incident response but weak vendor oversight, or strong transparency language but weak data inventory and rights handling. It also leads to evidence gaps, where the organization cannot prove controls operate because records are scattered or missing. The exam expects you to recognize that privacy is a system of controls, and systems require structure, especially when multiple teams are involved. A framework provides that structure by defining domains, activities, and outcomes that a mature program should cover, which helps leaders and practitioners see what is missing and what must be strengthened. Another issue frameworks solve is drift, meaning programs gradually become outdated as systems change, vendors change, and new data uses appear, and a framework provides a consistent reference for periodic review. Beginners sometimes think structure reduces flexibility, but in privacy governance, structure actually increases flexibility because it allows changes to be evaluated consistently. When you view frameworks as tools for preventing inconsistency and gaps, they become immediately relevant to real privacy engineering work. A privacy framework is most useful when you treat it as a mapping tool that connects obligations and principles to controls and evidence. Many obligations, such as transparency, rights handling, minimization, and accountability, can be expressed as principles, but principles alone do not tell you which controls must exist in practice. A framework helps by breaking the program into components, such as governance, risk assessment, data lifecycle management, vendor oversight, incident response, and monitoring, and then defining what good looks like in each component. Controls can then be selected and implemented within those components, and evidence can be tied to each control so auditors and leaders can verify performance. The exam expects you to understand this mapping because it is how privacy programs remain defensible and measurable, especially in complex organizations. Another important benefit is that frameworks help normalize language, meaning a product team and a compliance team can refer to the same program element with shared meaning, reducing confusion and miscommunication. Frameworks also help you build a control catalog, which is a set of controls your organization uses repeatedly rather than inventing new controls each time. For beginners, the key is to see that the framework is not the goal. The goal is a consistent set of controls and evidence that achieve privacy outcomes. The framework is the organizing map that makes that goal achievable. Different frameworks exist, but the exam's practical expectation is that you can use whichever structured approach your organization adopts and understand what it accomplishes. Generally Accepted Privacy Principles, GAPP, is one example often discussed in privacy contexts because it provides a set of privacy principles and program elements that can be used to structure a program. When an organization uses GAPP, it can align governance, transparency, collection and use practices, access controls, retention, monitoring, and enforcement into a coherent program. Other frameworks and governance models can also be relevant in broader control environments, such as control objectives for information and related technologies, COBIT, which is commonly used for governance and control management across information systems. Security-oriented frameworks, such as those from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, can also support privacy programs when mapped correctly, especially for safeguard and monitoring practices, even though privacy has additional obligations beyond security. The key skill is not memorizing framework details, but understanding that frameworks provide categories, expectations, and a shared model for controls and evidence. The exam may test whether you can choose a structured approach to ensure completeness and accountability rather than relying on informal practices. When you can explain how a framework helps align privacy and security controls with governance and evidence, you are demonstrating the kind of program-level reasoning the exam rewards. Frameworks support control selection by helping you see where a program is weak and by guiding you toward controls that match the program's goals. If a framework highlights rights handling as a core element, it prompts you to ask whether the organization has intake workflows, identity verification standards, data discovery capability, and response documentation. If a framework highlights transparency and notice, it prompts you to ask whether notices match processing and whether change management updates them when data use changes. If a framework highlights vendor oversight, it prompts you to ask whether contracts include purpose limits, sub-processor control, incident cooperation, and rights request support. If a framework highlights data lifecycle management, it prompts you to ask whether inventories are current, classification is consistent, retention is defined, and minimization is enforced. The exam expects you to recognize that a framework helps prevent blind spots, because teams often focus on what is visible, like a privacy notice, while missing less visible controls like access reviews or retention enforcement. Frameworks also help control consistency, because the same type of processing should trigger the same baseline controls across teams. Beginners sometimes treat controls as isolated fixes, but frameworks encourage controls to be organized as a coherent system, which reduces the chance that one control undermines another. For example, a strong transparency practice without a strong data inventory can produce misleading disclosures because the organization does not fully know what it does. When controls are structured through a framework, they reinforce each other rather than conflicting. Evidence is where frameworks become especially valuable, because evidence collection can become chaotic unless it is structured and intentional. A framework can serve as an evidence model, where each program element has expected evidence artifacts, such as policies, procedures, training records, assessment outputs, vendor due diligence records, access review logs, incident timelines, and rights request logs. This matters because audits and governance reviews often fail when evidence is missing, inconsistent, or scattered across teams. The exam often tests evidence thinking by asking how an organization can prove controls operate, and frameworks help by providing a predictable structure for where evidence should exist and what it should show. Evidence should demonstrate both design and operation, meaning not only that a policy exists, but that the policy is followed, such as through logs of completed reviews or records of decisions. Frameworks also support evidence proportionality, because not every control requires the same depth of evidence, and a structured approach helps determine what evidence is appropriate for different risk levels. Another important point is that evidence should be maintainable, because evidence that requires constant manual work will be skipped, leading to program drift. When evidence is designed into workflows, such as a vendor onboarding process that automatically stores due diligence records, the program becomes more reliable. Framework-guided evidence planning is one of the most effective ways to make privacy governance defensible and efficient. Frameworks also support governance decisions by giving leaders a structured basis for prioritization and resource allocation. Privacy programs must decide where to invest effort, such as improving data inventories, strengthening vendor oversight, enhancing incident response, or improving rights handling capacity. A framework helps leaders see which elements are foundational and which are currently weak, enabling decisions that reduce risk most effectively. The exam expects you to understand that governance decisions should be based on structured evaluation rather than on the most recent incident or the loudest stakeholder. Frameworks can also be used to set maturity goals, such as moving from ad hoc practices to defined and monitored processes, and those goals can guide budgeting and staffing decisions. Another governance use is risk acceptance, because frameworks provide a context for what controls are expected at different risk levels, making acceptance decisions more transparent and consistent. Frameworks also support cross-functional coordination because they create a shared agenda, allowing privacy, security, legal, engineering, and operations teams to align on program priorities. Beginners sometimes view governance as meetings and approvals, but frameworks turn governance into a structured practice of managing the program as a system. When governance is framework-based, it becomes easier to explain why certain controls are required and why certain risks cannot be accepted without additional safeguards. A practical way to apply a privacy framework is through mapping exercises that connect real processing activities to framework elements, because mapping turns abstract structure into actionable tasks. For example, if an organization introduces a new analytics feature, mapping helps ensure transparency is addressed, minimization is applied, consent is handled where relevant, data flows are documented, vendor sharing is controlled, retention is defined, and rights handling can reach the new datasets. If an organization adopts a new vendor, mapping ensures that vendor oversight elements are satisfied, including due diligence, contract terms, incident cooperation, and evidence retention. If an organization expands into new regions, mapping helps identify cross-border transfer elements, governance updates, and monitoring requirements. The exam expects you to be able to think this way because scenario questions often include one main change and then ask what must happen to remain compliant and trustworthy. Mapping also helps ensure that controls are not implemented unevenly because it prompts you to apply the same framework elements consistently across similar projects. Another benefit is that mapping reveals dependencies, such as rights handling depending on data inventory and vendor cooperation, which helps prioritize implementation tasks. Beginners sometimes attempt to solve privacy problems by adding one control, but mapping reveals that a system of controls is required. When you practice mapping mentally, you develop the ability to move quickly through complex scenarios. Frameworks must also be kept alive through monitoring and periodic review, because a framework does not help if it is adopted once and then ignored. Monitoring includes checking whether required controls are implemented and operating, whether metrics show improvement, and whether new processing activities are being assessed and documented as expected. Periodic reviews can evaluate whether program elements remain aligned with current processing, current vendors, and current obligations, especially as the organization changes. The exam may test whether you understand that frameworks support continuous improvement, not just initial program design, and that drift is a major risk in privacy programs. Drift can occur when teams add data uses without updating notices, when vendors change subprocessors without review, or when retention practices are not enforced over time. A framework-based review can identify these drift points because it provides a consistent checklist of program elements and expected evidence, though the work should still be thoughtful rather than purely mechanical. Another key idea is that frameworks help manage change by making the impact of change visible across multiple program areas. For example, a new data category might affect transparency, assessment requirements, access controls, retention, and rights handling, and a framework helps ensure none of those areas are overlooked. When a framework is used continuously, it becomes a stabilizing force that keeps the privacy program coherent as conditions evolve. As we close, using privacy frameworks to structure controls, evidence, and governance decisions means adopting a structured model that prevents gaps, increases consistency, and makes accountability measurable. Frameworks organize privacy work into program elements, allowing principles and obligations to be translated into practical controls that are implemented consistently across teams and projects. They also provide a structure for evidence, ensuring that policies, procedures, records, and monitoring artifacts can demonstrate both intent and operation during audits, incidents, and leadership reviews. Governance decisions become more defensible when leaders can prioritize improvements based on a framework view of program strengths and weaknesses, rather than reacting to the latest crisis. Framework mapping connects real processing activities to required controls, helping teams address transparency, minimization, vendor oversight, data lifecycle management, incident readiness, and rights handling as an integrated system. Ongoing monitoring and periodic review keep the framework alive, preventing drift as systems and vendors change and ensuring continuous improvement remains possible. The CDPSE exam rewards this capability because privacy engineering depends on structured, repeatable program design that can scale and remain defensible over time. When you can explain how a framework guides control selection, evidence planning, and governance decisions, you demonstrate the program-level maturity domain 2 is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.